My brother laughed as he called me a failed laborer in front of the city's elite. But when I found my forged signature on a blueprint designed to collapse, I realized my family wasn't just stealing my work, they were setting me up for a prison cell. They thought I was their convenient fall guy. They were wrong. Now, I'm going to show you how an empire crumbles when the foundation decides to walk away. My name is Evelyn Thorne, and at 29, I found myself standing in the velvet shadows of a Nashville penthouse, watching my brother, Julian, raise a crystal flute to the ceiling. The room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, and the hum of a merger secured by the designs for the Riverview Spire. My designs. Julian caught my eye across the crowded floor and offered a slow, predatory grin. To my sister, Evelyn, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the chatter of the city's elite. Who is still deciding what she wants to be when she finally grows up. Perhaps one day she'll wander off the construction site, wash the grime from her fingernails, and find herself a real career. A wave of polite, choreographed laughter rippled through the room. My parents clinked their glasses, their eyes never meeting mine. I stood perfectly still, a ghost in a designer gown. They saw a failure. They saw a girl who had plateaued as a site foreman. They had no idea I was the architect of their impending collapse. I didn't shatter the glass in my hand. I didn't cause a scene. I simply placed the flute on a passing waiter's tray with a soft, deliberate click. That tiny sound was the only punctuation I needed. Turning my back on the panoramic view of the skyline and the $3,000 tuxedos, I walked toward the elevator. Evelyn, don't you dare, my mother's voice hissed behind me, sharp with that familiar tone she used when I was a problem to be managed. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The elevator doors slid shut, severing the sound of the laughter like a guillotine. The silence in the descending metal box was deafening, but it was also the first time in years I felt I could breathe. As the numbers counted down from the penthouse to the lobby, the weight on my chest began to shift. Down on the street, the humid Tennessee night air felt heavy, pressing against my skin. I walked past the line of polished black town cars and uniformed chauffeurs to the far corner of the parking lot. There sat my truck. It was a decade-old Chevy, caked in the red clay and gray dust of a dozen job sites. The bed was cluttered with spirit levels and battered hard hats. The valet looked visibly relieved to hand over the keys. I climbed into the cab, the familiar scent of stale coffee, sawdust, and diesel instantly grounding me. I started the engine and drove away from the neon glow of Broadway, heading north toward the industrial districts. As the city lights blurred into long streaks against my window, I asked myself the question I knew the world would ask. Why had I stayed for 6 years? Why had I allowed them to treat me like a common laborer while Julian played the visionary? Why did I swallow the disrespect and the erasure? It wasn't weakness. That is the mistake people make about survivors of families like mine. They see a victim trapped by fear. But I wasn't trapped by fear. I was trapped by an invisible chain of responsibility. 3 years ago, when my father's firm began to buckle under the weight of its own incompetence, I didn't step in because I craved their approval. I stepped in because I understood the physics of our lives better than they did. I knew that if I didn't hold the weight, the roof would collapse on all of us. I was the structural pillar. I was the load-bearing wall. I absorbed the stress, the sleepless nights, the technical crises, and the financial terror so they could continue to live in an open-concept fantasy where money simply appeared and problems simply vanished. I stayed because I believed holding them up was my duty. I thought strength meant enduring the burden. But tonight, Julian had made the reality of my position clear. He didn't see a pillar. He saw a prop, something to be used and then mocked for its utility. He believed he could insult the foundation and still live in the penthouse. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I realized then that I wasn't just leaving a party or quitting a job. By walking out of that room, I was removing the structural integrity of their entire existence. They thought I was the failure because I was the one covered in dust. They failed to realize that the dust was the only thing holding the mortar together. I wasn't the failure. I was the only thing keeping them standing. And now I was gone. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply drove into the dark, feeling the massive, crushing weight lift off my shoulders and settle exactly where it belonged. On them. 3 years ago, the only thing my father, Thomas, was successfully building was a federal lawsuit. It was a catastrophic series of safety violations on the Cumberland River project, the kind of systemic negligence that doesn't just end careers, it buries companies. He was facing criminal charges and a financial crater so deep it looked like a mass grave for the family name. At the time, I was 25, 2 months away from defending my thesis at Stanford. I had a full fellowship and a future that didn't involve cleaning up my father's wreckage. But when he called me, weeping, desperate, pleading that the Thorne legacy was about to turn to ash, I made a choice. I chose blood over logic. I walked away from my degree, packed my life into 2 suitcases, and moved back to Nashville. For the next 18 months, I never saw the inside of a penthouse. I lived in a rusted construction trailer that smelled of sour coffee and damp drywall. I was the one who fired the incompetent foreman Julian had hired simply because they were his favorite drinking buddies. I was the one who recalculated the load-bearing stresses by hand because Julian had neglected to account for the lateral wind loads of a Tennessee storm. I negotiated with the ironworkers' unions, overhauled the supply chains, and corrected safety protocols that were bordering on homicidal. By the time the Riverview Spire opened, I had saved the firm over $2 million in fines and delays. $2 million. Julian showed up for the ribbon cutting in a bespoke suit, beaming for the local news cameras. I stood in the back, my boots covered in dust, clutching a grease-stained clipboard. I thought I had earned a seat at the table. I thought I had finally paid the debt. But as I woke up the morning after the gala, staring at the ceiling of my cramped studio apartment, I realized my sacrifice hadn't bought me respect. It had only bought them enough time to figure out how to replace me. My phone began to vibrate against the nightstand. It wasn't an apology. It was an assault. The first text was from Julian. "You embarrassed Dad last night. Grow up and answer your phone." The second was a voicemail from my mother, Eleanor. Her voice was tight and clipped, that razor-sharp tone she reserved for managing a PR crisis. "Evelyn, we need to discuss the intellectual property rights for the Spire. The investors are asking about the design attribution. We need you to come in today and sign the transfer paperwork. Stop being selfish. This merger is bigger than your ego." They didn't want me back. They wanted my signature. They knew the designs were legally mine, and they needed me to sign them away so they could sell the firm without a hitch. Then came the leverage. A message arrived from the site foreman, a man named Miller, who had taught me more about the soul of a building than any professor ever could. He sent a screenshot of an email from Julian. It was a termination notice for my entire crew. My brother was threatening to fire the very people who had built his reputation, just to spite me. I sat up. The sadness I expected to feel was absent. In its place was a cold, obsidian clarity. I opened a professional networking site and found Julian's latest post. He had shared a photo from the gala, a polished shot of the visionary team. In the original photo, I had been standing on the far left. In the version Julian posted, I had been cropped out. I was gone. Erased. The caption read, "Visionary leadership requires bold action. Proud to lead this firm into the future." I looked at the empty space where I used to be. They didn't just want to steal my work, they wanted to delete my existence while pocketing the profit I had generated. They thought a digital crop would make me disappear. They forgot that I was the one who poured the foundation. And if you remove the foundation, the entire structure eventually finds the ground. I didn't reply to the texts. I didn't return my mother's call. I got out of bed, brewed a cup of black coffee, and walked over to my drafting table. I didn't need to scream. I needed my portfolio. I didn't engage with the threats or the gaslighting. I treated their panic like background noise on a loud job site, dangerous, yes, but ultimately irrelevant to the work. I put on my only tailored suit, the one I had bought for a graduation I never attended. I took the encrypted drive containing the metadata, the original design files, and the handwritten calculations from 3 years ago. I tucked them into my leather case. I wasn't just leaving a job, I was preparing for a demolition. I tucked the files into my leather case. Then, I drove downtown, past the skeleton of the Riverview Spire, toward the glass monolith that housed the only firm in Nashville that truly terrified my father. Alexandra Sterling was a legend. She didn't just build skyscrapers, she altered the horizon. She was ruthless, brilliant, and she had been trying to acquire my father's firm for a decade, if only to dismantle it and salvage the parts. I walked into her lobby without an appointment. I looked the assistant in the eye and said, "Tell Alexandra, I have the wind load calculations for the Riverview project. Tell her they're wrong." 5 minutes later, I was sitting in a corner office that likely cost more than my parents' estate. Alexandra didn't offer me water. She didn't smile. She sat behind a desk that looked like a jagged slab of obsidian and waited. I didn't waste time with a resume. I opened my portfolio and laid the schematics on the glass. Not the sanitized ones Julian had presented at the gala, but the real ones, the ones with the corrected load-bearing ratios, dated 18 months ago. Alexandra put on her glasses. She traced the lines with a manicured finger, stopping at the structural core analysis. She looked at the date, then she looked at me. "Julian submitted a revision to the city last week," she said, her voice cool and level. "He reduced the steel reinforcement by 20% to cut costs." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm here. If you build it his way, the torque from a winter gale will snap the spine of that building within 3 years." Alexandra sat back, removing her glasses. "You're the one," she said softly. "You're the one who fixed the grade slope on the Meridian site. You're the one who renegotiated the steel contracts." It wasn't a question. "I am." "Why?" she asked. "Why did you stay? Why did you let them pay you a foreman's wage for a partner's work?" I started to give her the usual defense about loyalty and family legacy, but Alexandra cut me off. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Do you know what functional fixedness is, Evelyn?" I shook my head. "It's a cognitive bias," she explained. "If you use a hammer to pound nails every day for 10 years, your brain stops seeing it as a tool made of metal and wood. It only sees a hammer. It literally cannot conceive that the hammer could be used as a paperweight, or a doorstop, or a weapon. Your family suffered from that. They saw you in a hard hat, covered in dust, fixing their mistakes. They became functionally fixed on your utility as a laborer. They couldn't see you as an architect because they were addicted to your function as a fixer." She tapped the blueprints. "They confused price with value. They thought because you were cheap, you were worth less. They didn't realize you were the most expensive asset they had. They didn't steal this because they are purely evil, though they certainly are. They stole it because they genuinely believe they own you. They think you are the hammer." It was the first time anyone had explained my life to me without using the word love to justify the abuse. It was clinical. It was precise. It was the architecture of my own erasure. "I am not a hammer," I said. Alexandra smiled, and it was a dangerous, predatory expression. "No. You are the architect who is going to help me bury them. You're hired. Senior project manager, double your current salary, and I want the equity rights to these designs." "Done," I said. I walked out of her office with a job offer signed in wet ink. I wasn't shaking anymore. I checked my phone and saw 14 missed calls from Julian. I didn't block him. I wanted him to be able to reach me when the ground finally started to shake. The glass walls of my new office at Sterling Associates offered a clear view of the city's skeleton. I could see the cranes, the steel girders, the pulsing arteries of traffic. I had been there for 3 weeks. The salary was real. The respect was real. But I couldn't stop watching the progress on the Riverview spire. It was an itch in the back of my brain, a structural anomaly I couldn't ignore. I knew Julian. I knew he was lazy, but I also knew he was cheap. The revision Alexandra had mentioned, the 20% reduction in steel, kept playing on a loop in my mind. How did he get that approved? The city inspectors are notoriously difficult. You can't just delete structural support without a new engineering sign-off. Late one Tuesday, when the office was quiet and bathed in the blue light of the monitors, I logged into the Metropolitan Building portal. It's public record, anyone can look up a permit with a parcel number. I typed it in. The file loaded slowly. I navigated to the structural schematics and opened the PDF. I zoomed in on the foundational strata. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the layout I had finalized 6 months ago. It was an early draft. Draft 4. I remembered it vividly because it was the draft where I had miscalculated the lateral wind load for a 100-year storm. It was the version that would sway too much. It was the version where the concrete would crack, then spall, and then, under the right pressure, shear off completely. I had tossed that draft into the trash a year ago. I had looked Julian in the eye and told him, in no uncertain terms, that this version would kill people. Why had he submitted it? Because draft 4 relied on inferior materials. It bypassed the expensive cross-bracing I had integrated into the final version, saving the firm $3 million in raw steel. My skin went cold as I scrolled to the bottom of the digital document. Every flawed design requires a certification. They needed a professional engineer's stamp to absorb the liability. Julian wasn't a PE. My father's license had been revoked years ago. I reached the bottom right corner of the blueprint and stopped breathing. There it was, the circular ink stamp. Evelyn Thorne, professional engineer, license number 04921. And across it, slashed in bold blue ink, was my signature. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. I hadn't signed this. I had never stamped draft 4. I had locked my physical seal in the wall safe at the family office before I walked out. The realization hit me with the force of a demolition ball. This wasn't just about greed or securing a merger. This was something far more predatory. They knew the building was unstable. They knew the wind shear would eventually tear the spine from the structure. They wanted the profit from the cheap materials, but they refused to carry the risk. So they forged my life away. If that tower went up and when it came down, Julian wouldn't go to prison. Thomas wouldn't go to prison. I would. I was the engineer of record. They were grooming me to be the architect of a catastrophe, perfectly willing to bury me under the rubble of their own arrogance. I closed the laptop. The fear evaporated, replaced by a rage so cold it burned. They wanted a fall guy. Instead, they had just handed me the weapon I needed to finish them. The humid wind swept across the river as I stood at the back of the event tent, watching my family toast a monument built on lies. My father was busy charming the city council. My mother was circling a group of venture capitalists like a hawk, and Julian stood at the podium, his hand tight around a gold-plated shovel, selling a dream he had no right to own. Beside me, Alexandra and Inspector Reed carried the weight of the truth, the forged documents, the falsified safety reports, and the evidence of the stolen seal. As we walked down the center aisle, the festive chatter died in an instant. Julian tried to laugh it off, offering a half-hearted jab at my sudden appearance, but his composure shattered the moment Reed announced that the site was officially a crime scene. I didn't need to shout. I simply displayed the forged blueprints bearing my stolen signature, and the simulation that projected the tower's inevitable, lethal collapse. The investors didn't just leave, they fled. Officers stepped forward. Julian let the golden shovel slip through his fingers, the metal clanging uselessly against the red clay. In the fallout, forensic audits unraveled a decade of systemic corruption. My father's credentials were stripped. My mother begged for a financial lifeline I would never extend. Julian is currently awaiting trial for fraud and reckless endangerment. I moved on. From my new corner office as a partner at Sterling Associates, I look out over the empty lot where their empire once stood, and toward the rising steel of my own project, the Meridian Spire. I recently cleaned my engineering stamp. It is no longer a weapon but a tool. I've come to understand that justice isn't found in the act of destruction, it's found in building something more resilient beside the ruins others left behind. I didn't bury them. I simply stopped holding them up.